Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. For this week's video, we're going to get into the picks for week 2 of the 2021-22 college football season. Before we do that though, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notifications so that way you'll be alerted whenever a new video drops on my channel. Last week for week 1, the picks went pretty well. I finished 17-3 overall. 4-1 out of the top 25 matchups. The only one of those I got wrong was Penn State did in fact beat Wisconsin. I called Wisconsin to win that game, and I got that one wrong. The other couple of ones that I missed on was North Carolina went down, the number 10 team in the nation, went down to Virginia Tech on the road. And disappointingly, the Washington Huskies lost to FCS Montana at home and only scored 7 points doing it. Oh, Washington. You always seem to disappoint me at the worst possible times in the last few years. Anyways, though, overall, a pretty strong start. There are only 2 top 25 matchups this week for week 2, one of which is a top 10 matchup. So we have the first of those picks to do. A lot of easy picks this week because as opposed to week 1, there aren't as many interesting matchups going on for week 2. Week 2 is when we're seeing a lot of cupcake games being played that will allow some teams to get on track because as I commented in my last video, it seemed like there were a lot of teams in week 1 that just were not ready to go. So we'll see if they can get back into the swing of things with week 2 against lesser competition before we start getting into conference schedules in the next couple of weeks. So without further ado, let's jump right in. The number 1 team in the nation, the Alabama Crimson Tide, coming off a big win over number 14 Miami. They are playing Mercer at home, so obviously you're going to go with Alabama. The new number 2 team in the nation, the Georgia Bulldogs, with that nasty defense, they are home against UAB. Although University of Alabama Birmingham isn't a team to necessarily sleep on, they're taking on Georgia. Although Georgia's got a few players who are now out because of COVID contact tracing and positive tests for COVID. Plus, they've had a few offensive people who were out in week 1 because of injury. So Georgia's personnel is getting kind of thin. I don't think that's going to play a factor in the game against UAB. I think they'll win that game. I think their defense is going to be too much for UAB to overcome. Georgia's offense, though, well, we'll see what happens with that. They only scored 10 points last week, but it was against a pretty stout Clemson defense. We'll see if JT Daniels can produce a little bit more this week, but go with Georgia nonetheless on this one. One of the 2 top 25 matchups is number 3, Ohio State, hosting number 12, Oregon this week. So for this game, one of the biggest storylines is that Oregon's top defensive lineman, Kayvon Thibodeau, is day-to-day with an ankle injury that he sustained in their first game last week against Fresno State. He's been seen walking around in a walking boot all week, so even if he is able to play in that game, he's not going to be 100%, and he's not going to be as productive as he would be if he came into the game entirely healthy, which puts a lot more pressure on Oregon's defense to be able to stop Ohio State's offense. Last week against Minnesota, Ohio State pulled away in the second half, but they let Minnesota hang around for all of the first half and into the third quarter a bit. Quarterback C.J. Stroud was 13 for 22 for 294 yards, 4 touchdowns, and only 1 interception. The Buckeyes had 201 rush yards. 125 of those were by one running back, though. Their defense had 2 sacks, only allowed 203 rush yards. 163 of those were to Minnesota's Mo Ibrahim, who's out for the season now with a lower leg injury. So, although Ohio State kind of puttered around in that game and it took C.J. Stroud a little bit of time to get going, eventually they did start producing and they did look like they were starting to get back into form. As far as Oregon goes, they played Fresno State and they beat them by a touchdown last week. Quarterback Anthony Brown was 15 of 24 for 172 yards and a touchdown. He also had 56 rush yards. Oregon as a team had 186 rush yards and 3 touchdowns. Their defense had 3 turnovers, 4 sacks. They only allowed 75 rush yards, but they did allow 298 passing yards, which doesn't bode well going up against C.J. Stroud and those wide receivers that Ohio State has. The game is at the Shoe, so Oregon is traveling across the country to play a game in one of the most hostile environments for a road team to play in the college football world. Their star defender is either going to be out or is going to be hobbled. Their defense seemed to be a little bit weak on the pass, which seems like that's where Ohio State's strength is going to be on offense this year. Ohio State's defense didn't seem like it was that great last week, not up to the level it's been the last couple of seasons, but I think they'll play well enough against Anthony Brown and the Ducks offense that they'll stymie the running game, and I think Ohio State's going to come out with the win on this one. I'm not sure how good of a game this is going to be because with only one game of evidence so far this season, it's kind of hard to gauge what these matchups are going to be like. I think Ohio State's going to win the game. I think their passing attack is going to be what's going to get them this win. I think their defense will load up against the run because I'm not sure if they fully trust that Anthony Brown is going to be able to beat them if they were to stymie Oregon's run game. So look for OSU to triumph in that top 25 matchup. Number 4, Oklahoma. They are home against Western Carolina. They, with that unimpressive win against Tulane last week, they actually dropped 2 spots in the rankings down to number 4. I think they're angry about that. I think they come in and I think they beat down Western Carolina. So go with Oklahoma. Texas A&M, they're at Colorado. I don't know too much about Colorado, but Texas A&M seems like they're pretty good. They let Kent State hang around for a bit too long, but then finally in the second half, they really started to pull away and really started to, impose their will on Kent State. So I'm going to go with Texas A&M to go on the road against a Pac-12 team and score a win. Number 6, Clemson, who lost that tough game against Georgia last week. They are home this week against South Carolina State. Look for them to bomb South Carolina State out of the stadium. Go with Clemson. Number 7, Cincinnati, coming off a beatdown on their opponent last week. They are home versus Murray State. Look for another big win from them. Go with the Bearcats. Number 8, Notre Dame, coming off a big win against Florida State, where they were up by 18 points going into the fourth quarter, but needed overtime to win by 3 against a game Florida State team that I think is going to be better than I initially expected them to be this season. That Notre Dame team, they are on the road versus Toledo. Look for Notre Dame to have a secure victory on that one. Go with the Fighting Irish. The biggest matchup of the entire weekend pits number 9, Iowa State, the Cyclones, who had dropped 2 spots after their unimpressive victory, their 16-10 victory over Northern Iowa. They are taking on against Northern Iowa, They're taking on this week number 10, Iowa, who jumped up 8 spots in the rankings after their absolute dismantling of then number 17, Indiana. This is a fascinating matchup because neither Iowa nor Iowa State, when you dive into the stats, looked super impressive. The final score of the Iowa-Indiana game looked eye-popping because they absolutely tore apart the Indiana Hoosiers. However, that could be indicative of a couple of things. It could be indicative of maybe Iowa is just that dang good. It could also, though, be indicative of maybe Indiana isn't what we thought they were. Maybe they were way too highly ranked going into this season, and maybe this is going to be a tough season for them, and they're just not as good as we initially thought they were going into the season. Or it could be a combination of both. Iowa State, meanwhile, despite the fact that I called the game being a tough game for Iowa State, I did also say that I thought Iowa State would pull away in the second half, which they did not do, and they only won by 6 points in that game. So when you look at the stats, neither team really looked super impressive. Iowa Their quarterback, Spencer Petras, was 13 of 27, so under 50% completion percentage for just 145 yards. They were only 33% on third down conversions on offense. They had 158 rushing yards, which is good. Their defense had 1 sack, 3 interceptions, 2 of which were pick sixes. They only allowed 77 rushing yards and 156 passing yards to Michael Penix Jr. and the Indiana offense. So their defense certainly won them that game. Their offense looked real pedestrian at best in that game, though. Meanwhile, Iowa State, Brock Purdy, their quarterback, was 21 of 26, which is a good completion percentage, but only for 199 yards. He's going to have to play a little bit better than that and throw the ball around a little bit more if they want to compete in the Big 12 Conference against the likes of Texas, Oklahoma, and all those other teams. They only had 134 rush yards against Northern Iowa, which doesn't bode well for the beginning of the season. They're going to have to get that run game going if it wants to help take the pressure off Brock Purdy in tough games later on this season, like the game tomorrow against Iowa. Their defense had 2 sacks, 1 pick, and allowed only 45 yards of rushing. So again, the defenses for both Iowa and Iowa State played well. The offenses, not so much. Both of them were quite a bit shaky in these opening games. We'll see what kind of corrections they can make with having a week to prepare for this big-time rivalry game that has now become the season's second matchup of top 10 teams. The game is at Iowa State. And this has been a tough game to call. I've been going back and forth in my mind what I think is going to happen with this one. Iowa State. I think what I'm doing on this one is, if you've watched these pick videos, you know that I don't just use stats and metrics to make my picks. I also like to take into account intangibles like revenge games, trap games, that type of thing. I think in this game, Iowa has been sitting back the whole offseason, listening to the chatter coming from pundits and commentators about how Iowa State is going to win their conference this year. Iowa State has a shot to crash the college football playoff. Wisconsin is going to bounce back and win the Big Ten West. Minnesota has what it takes to win the Big Ten West. Indiana is going to be the darling of the conference this year. Can Ohio State simply reload, losing Justin Fields, and can they repeat as Big Ten champs? Not many people have been talking about Iowa. I'm sure some have, but I haven't heard many national pundits this offseason giving a lot of love to the Iowa Hawkeyes. I think Iowa's been sitting back listening to all that chatter and just going, all right, we'll see about all that stuff. We'll see what happens. And I think the first box they wanted to check off was knocking down Indiana a few pegs. Check. I think the second box is going into Iowa State, deflating their chances at the college football playoff, and coming out with a win. I think they get the check mark on that one too. I think Iowa comes in with a massive chip on their shoulder. I think they're not intimidated by the Iowa State fans and that tornado siren warning that they've got that they play on third downs and when the Iowa State players are about to come on the field. I think Iowa goes into this game. I think it's a close game. I think offensive production is tough to come by, but I think Iowa does enough to get the win in this one. So I am going with the Iowa Hawkeyes. Number 11, Penn State, coming off a big win on the road against Wisconsin. They are home against Ball State. Go with the Nittany Lions on this one. Number 12, Oregon. I've already called them losing to number 3, Ohio State. Number 13, Florida. The Gators are on the road at South Florida, who got bombed into oblivion by North Carolina State. I don't expect it to be any different this time. Go with Florida. Number 14, USC. They're taking on a Stanford team that got beat down by Kansas State last week. It's at USC. Go with the Trojans for this one. Number 15, Texas, coming off an impressive win against ranked Louisiana, is on the road against Arkansas, an SEC opponent. Steve Sarkisian's debut is off to a good start. I'm going to go with Texas on this one on the road. I don't know much about Arkansas. I know what I saw in that Texas game, and they looked impressive, despite the fact that they were taking on a group of 5 school. I did think that group of 5 school was going to put up a bit more of a fight. I did think Louisiana had a little bit more in them than what they showed, and I think that's the result of Texas playing very well rather than Louisiana not playing well. So go with the Longhorns for the win against Arkansas. Number 16, UCLA. They're up 26 spots. They weren't ranked last week. Now, after that win against 16th ranked LSU, they are jumping into the top 25 at number 16. They have a bye week this week, so they're going to win the bye week. Number 17, Coastal Carolina. They are playing tonight. They are playing in about 6 hours against Kansas. Kansas last week took on an FCS team in South Dakota, and they won by a field goal, 17-14, after which the Kansas football faithful stormed the field, which it's Kansas football, so I think you give them a pass on that one. But still, their quarterback, Jason Bean, was 17 of 26 for 163 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 54 running yards. Kansas only had 84 rush yards total in that game, and 54 of them, as I just said, were from their quarterback. So the run game looks like it's going to be pretty abysmal this year. Their defense only allowed 98 passing yards and 167 rushing yards, though, to an FCS team. That's not going to bode well because Coastal Carolina in their game last week had 268 rushing yards. Coastal Carolina was 4 of 6 on third down conversions. Their defense only allowed 14 passing yards to the Citadel and 223 rush yards, which the Citadel is one of those military academies that runs a form of the triple option, so they don't pass the ball a lot. But the fact that they held a team that runs a triple option to just 223 rushing yards, I think is impressive. Coastal Carolina is favored by 26 points in this game as of this morning. So, unfortunately for you, Kansas Jayhawk football fans, your winning streak ends at 1. So go with Coastal Carolina, the Chanticleers, the most fearsome of the barnyard animals in this game. I love some of these names of these college football teams. They're so good. Number 18, Wisconsin, falling down a few places after their loss at home against Penn State, are home once again against Eastern Michigan. Look for Wisconsin to bounce back and win that game at home. Number 19, Virginia Tech, climbing into the top 25 after their win against North Carolina last week. They are home versus Middle Tennessee State. Go with the Hokies on this one. Number 20, Ole Miss, coming off a big win against Louisville, where they looked very impressive on offense, running a ridiculously fast system where they're running plays about every, I think it said 16 seconds they were running plays. The broadcast did not even have enough time to get replays in after every play when Ole Miss had the ball on offense because they were moving just too fast. They are home versus Austin Peay. Look for them to go to 2-0. Go with Ole Miss. In another big matchup, not against 2 ranked teams, but a big rivalry game, we've got the Holy War. Number 21 ranked Utah coming off a not super impressive win against an FCS team in Weber State, going on the road to in-state rival BYU, who had a more impressive but not terrifically impressive win against Pac-12 team Arizona last week. Utah has won 9 straight Holy Wars against BYU. Last week against Weber State, Utah let them hang in for way too long before they finally decided to lay the hammer down and began to pull away from them in the second half of that game. Quarterback Charlie Brewer, formerly of Baylor University, was 19 of 27 for only 233 yards and 2 touchdowns. They had 189 rush yards in the game, though, so a pretty balanced attack coming from this incarnation of the Utah Utes. Their defense had 3 sacks and an interception. They were only 2 of 8 on third down, though, on offense. That's a problem. BYU, meanwhile, against Arizona, an FBS opponent out of the Pac-12. Quarterback Jaron Hall for BYU was 18 of 28 for 198 yards and 2 touchdowns. They had 163 rushing yards. So again, another balanced attack coming out of BYU. Their defense had 4 sacks, an interception, held Arizona to just 81 rushing yards on the game. But they let up 336 passing yards. And the Cougars were only 5 of 17 on third down conversions. So there's reason to think that either team could win. Balanced attack from Utah, 9 straight wins in the Holy War. Maybe that kind of gets into the mindset of BYU that, geez, what do we got to do to beat these guys in this game? But Utah was only 2 of 8 on third down, and they played an FCS team and didn't look real impressive playing them, especially in the first half last week. BYU played a much more impressive opponent, had a more impressive win, let up a lot of passing yards, had a good defensive performance other than that, though, but was only 5 of 17 on third down, but they were 3 for 3 on fourth down, including a couple of times where they were going for it on third down from their own 35-yard line. They were taking chances, and they were making those chances pay off. This one was probably, besides the Iowa State game, the hardest one for me to pick, because I watched a little bit of both games. I wasn't real impressed with either team. The stats are decent, but not eye-popping. I was leaning towards Utah for a while because of that win streak, but then I started to think, it's on the road. I think BYU wants to prove that their quarterback from last season, Zach Wilson, who's in the NFL now, he was not the be-all, end-all of BYU football. I think they really want to show that they are more than just Zach Wilson. I like the fact that they were taking chances against Arizona. I think BYU realizes that if they want to win some games against some big-time opponents, they're going to have to take some risks. Sometimes those risks will pay off. Sometimes they won't pay off. But I like the fact that they were taking some chances on those fourth down conversions. I think it is very difficult, unless you are the Alabamas of the world, the Clemsons of the world. I think it's very difficult to win 10 consecutive years against a major rival, let alone a major in-state rival who's just up the road from you, or in this case, I think just down the road from you. It's at BYU. I'm going to call the upset on this one. My gut ultimately led towards BYU on this one. I think they upset 21st ranked Utah in a close, real competitive, real heated game like you would expect from the Holy War. Number 22, Miami of Florida, coming off a beatdown at the hands of the Alabama Crimson Tide, dropping 8 spots in the rankings. They're home against Appalachian State. I think Miami rebounds on this one. I think they play much better. I think they get the win. Number 23, Arizona State, coming off their own win. I think against an FCS team. They are home again against UNLV. Go with Arizona State and the Fighting Herm Edwardses. Number 24, North Carolina, dropping 14 spots, almost out of the top 10, almost out of the top 25, rather, after their loss on the road against Virginia Tech. They are home versus Georgia State. Despite my misgivings about North Carolina's offense this season, I think they're going to win this game. I think they are not necessarily angry that they lost, but I think they're worried. And I think Mac Brown has got to make some changes on offense very quickly before they get into conference play. I think they take down Georgia State at home, go with the Tar Heels. And finally, number 25, Auburn, jumping into the rankings this week. They are home against Alabama State. Go with the Auburn Tigers on this one. So that does it for this week's picks. Thanks so much for tuning in. In a couple of days, I hope to have another video up that will analyze how well I did and go over what I learned from week 2 of the 2021 college football season. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on those notifications so that way you're alerted to when new videos drop about college football, about history, about Robert's Rules of Order, or about any other topic that I choose to make some videos on. Thanks so much again for tuning in, and I'll see you all next time.